Terry Kramer is an adjunct professor in decisions, operations, and technology management here at UCLA Anderson, where he teaches technology management. He's also a faculty advisor in the GAP program and the SMR program. Prior to joining Anderson, Terry has had a 30-year career in telecommunications. For about 18 of these 30 years, Terry worked for Vodafone Group in a variety of roles, domestically and internationally, including Group Strategy and Business Improvement Director. In June 2012, Terry received an appointment by President Obama to serve as ambassador, head of US delegation for the World Conference on International Telecommunications. Last but not least, Terry holds a bachelor's degree in economics from UCLA and an MBA from Harvard University. Now, John Stankey, our keynote, is the CEO of AT&T Entertainment Group and is responsible for the company's position facing the consumer market segment. He leads strategy, marketing, and operations around the development and the distribution of a premier entertainment experience. John oversees AT&T's entertainment offerings, including TV, video, and content development, its consumer mobility and wireless products, and its high-speed internet services, as well as its advertising business. Previously, John served as the Chief Strategy Officer, as the President and CEO of AT&T Business Solutions, and as the President and CEO of AT&T Operations. In his spare time, John is also on the BOV of UCLA Anderson, and a native of California, John earned a bachelor's degree in finance from LMU and his MBA from UCLA Anderson. Without any further ado, let's welcome Terry Kramer and John Stankey.
So John, let me start out. You're a class of 91, an amazing career at AT&T. I mean, Guillaume covered, you recently headed the enterprise business, you've been chief strategy officer, and now you head all the consumer-facing businesses. As you look back on your time at Anderson, how did that experience kind of affect your career journey?
The Peter Principle.
Okay.
It's interesting, as a guy who's getting close to the twilight of his career, I was thinking back a few years and trying to think about what things you remember the most. And I think what things I remember the most are absolutely about the people aspects of the work. And I think one of the things that you learn here at Anderson, and one of the things that you learn early in life, is how you relate to other people, how you get along with other people, how you get people to want to form in teams. And I've had the opportunity to work on a lot of different things in my career. I don't think I'm going to be reflecting 3 years from now on that particular project or that particular piece of technology that was deployed or what transaction we did, but I will remember all the people that I worked with. I will remember the integrations of various companies that we acquired and the cultures that had to be brought together. And I think it was preparing to work with other folks that really was the big difference and is really the key enabler that goes across any line of business, any function, anything you do.
Mm-hmm. Makes a lot of sense. John, let's talk now more about the industry, because you're leading an organization now in a fascinating set of areas. Mobility, pay TV with DirecTV, high-speed internet. Some cynics and critics will say those businesses are being disrupted. Some will say, hey, there's all this great innovation going on. Some will talk about convergence. Tell us, as you look across your patch, where do you see the greatest opportunities? Where do you have concerns?
Oh, I don't think it's a cynic that says they're being disrupted. It's hard to find any business right now in any industry isn't experiencing some degree of disruption. And I will tell you, the core of every aspect of our business, every line of business has got a variety of disruptors coming at it, and that's just part of your day. Our decision and what we're trying to do, I would acknowledge that pay TV, as an example, is a very mature business. And doesn't mean it's not a profitable business, and doesn't mean it's not still rife with opportunity to extend the product line and drive additional cash. But there's no doubt that the pay TV business is going to be very different 5, 6, 7 years from now than it is today. And our point of view on this is we'd like to come at that transformation from a position of strength, not a position of weakness. You know, where we have strength as a business is in connectivity-based services. That's our fundamental. We move bits, and we get paid to move bits, and we return capital on the bits that we move. And it just so happens that it doesn't matter whether it's a fixed connection or a mobile connection, those bits are more and more becoming entertainment-based, and typically they have a video component to it. So our belief is, for a period of time while this transformation is going forward, it's necessary for us to play in different parts of the value chain than where we've historically played, to make sure that we're still in a position to continue to ultimately attract traffic onto our network. And our belief is that premium entertainment will matter for a period of time, that yes, there is fragmentation, there's going to be additional choices that come about, but there will still be a place for good, solid, premium and emotional entertainment, and it's necessary for us to play in that from a position of strength and scale. And so our approach to this is not buying a satellite company because we love satellite technology. We don't particularly think it's a state-of-the-art moving forward technology, and but our view of this was to get scale and a cost of goods sold position on content, and then use what we can do, which is we build good IP networks we can distribute over mobility. We're really good at bringing services together in a way that we can ultimately take friction out of that experience for a customer and use that as a way to attract more traffic over time. And that's fundamentally what's going on, and fully acknowledge that this is going to be a very different business in 5 years than what it is today.
Yeah. And John, let's drill down a bit deeper on that, because the DirecTV acquisition was a huge bet. There's more and more people obviously talking about unbundling. I look at my own kids and they look at me saying, why do you have a subscription to anything? Everything is over the top. Verizon seems like one of your key competitors. Seems like they're kind of shifting a different direction. They're doing a lot of investment in content. They seem like they're not investing as much in their FiOS. Say more about the DirecTV acquisition, and do you worry about these trends on unbundling and over the top, et cetera?
Well, we pay attention to trends on what's occurring, and obviously when you go into a transaction like this, you want to put your best thinking behind it. And if you went and looked at the M&A models that we did when we're doing the transaction, we have an assumption that there's going to be an erosion of pay TV subscription over time. Now, the big $69 question is whether that erosion will be faster or slower than the rate we picked, and obviously ran sensitivities on that. And our belief is, when you look at the efficiencies and the benefits we could get out of doing the transaction and how they were front-end loaded in the transaction, there was some insulation from the downside scenario if ultimately the shift in the pay TV industry occurred faster than what we picked. Our expectation is that not only will there be fewer people subscribing to what we'll call the heavy bundle, but even those that subscribe to it will continue to thin it out. They're going to buy a little less. They're making those decisions today, and that's okay. The other thing we would expect will happen is that the bundle itself will probably become a little bit more feature-rich than it is today. It's not that people are disengaging from the content that's sold in the bundle. They're just watching it in a different way. People want to watch the content on their terms. They want to watch more than one episode, if you will, at a time. They want access to it wherever they want to go. One of the things that Netflix has done incredibly well is you can get it on any device. You can watch more than one series at a point in time, and there's a broad library and selection to choose from. And there's no reason why the pay TV construct can't look more like that and take a fairly mature product and extend it a little while longer and to a certain set of demographics. There are going to be some that don't ever want to engage with it, but there will be others that hold it and carry it forward for a period of time. It's managing through that transition that matters. So I think it's just a reality of any time you get into a mature business and a transitioning business, you have to manage these moments. I think we're comfortable doing that from a risk perspective. When I was joking with some folks this morning in a session, the thing I was managing when I came into this business was 14 cent a minute long distance and whether or not we could give people access to another alternate carrier. And that seemed like a really challenging problem at the time, and it seems very quaint today. And there's multiple transitions that have occurred since that time on technology platforms and products. We don't make money from selling fixed line long distance anymore. You know, it's not even in the product set. This is just another one of those transitions we'll manage through.
Makes sense, makes sense. One other question on DirecTV. You've obviously owned it now just for a couple of months or so, a few months. Any early read on it? Is it playing out early on as you expected? Any worrisome surprises now that you're the owner?
You know, no. I got to answer the question that way, right? I was the guy who negotiated the transaction, so. I think it's, first of all, we had an extended approval process, right? So combination of typical due diligence you go into. I think it's been reported publicly that this probably wasn't our first time around looking at the opportunity, and so you get to know a business period over time through diligence and through study, and then we went through this, 14-month approval process, and while that was going on within the confines of the law, there was a lot of collaboration between the two companies, and so I think by the time we closed it, it was hard to be surprised, is what I would tell you. Now, the fundamental underpinnings of why we did the transaction, we've communicated those externally. We've talked about the fact that we'll be at a $1.8 billion synergy run rate, by 2018. All that's fallen into place. So if you think about one of the big saving and efficiency issues was what we did to our cost of goods sold on content. The 2016 number is, in the bag, right? You negotiate contracts, you pay on them going forward. So we already know what 16 is going to look like, and I'll tell you, we've done what we needed to do there. We already have a good start on 17. The content efficiency issue was one of the major reasons to do the transaction. Feel pretty good about where that stands and that we're going to get to where we need to get. I've done 8 major transactions during the course of my career, taking out replicate overheads from administration. Those are things I think we understand how to do. The numbers are starting to show. If you looked at the first quarter margin equation for the consolidated business, 100 basis points of improvement in margins. A lot of that comes from pulling out some of the redundancies and efficiencies. If you look at advertising spend and efficiency, we almost spend about $2 billion a year in advertising. You can imagine that if you can get a little bit of efficiency in your buy between the two businesses now, run your campaigns a little bit more efficiently, place a little more efficiently, there's going to be money that falls out of that. So the foundation of why the shareholders wanted to support the transaction feel really, really good about. And that piece will happen over this 0 to 3 year time frame. What is the unknown is how this industry evolves beyond 3 years and the rate of change that goes in entertainment and what occurs on that. And we think we have a point of view on that. We think we're running the right plays on that, but you won't know until we get 3 years out. We can come back and talk about that, right?
Yep, makes sense. Let's shift over now, John, to the wireless business. Obviously, you've got a huge wireless business here in the U.S. T-Mobile has made a lot of unique stands in the industry, calling themselves the Un-carrier. The CEO there has made a lot of disparaging remarks about the competitors in the industry. They've tried to erase contracts with customers, et cetera, et cetera. What's your take on T-Mobile and their impact on the industry?
So, give credit where credit is due. I think he took a asset that was maybe being underutilized, and he certainly has breathed life back into it. He's done it in a way that I'm not sure I would have run the same playbook, but he probably has a different set of motivations, and the question is, what's the end game? If I sit and ask the question, do I aspire to be a single play wireless provider moving forward without scale? I think the answer to that is no. And so, irrespective of whatever the short-term successes he's achieved, I don't know that you're sitting in a great position in terms of the longevity of the asset absent some structural change. And so if you're running a business where your goal is ultimately structural change, you may do some things differently in the near term or the short term than if you're running a business where ultimately your objective is longevity and sustainability. And so I think there's a lot of different ways to value assets, and if your valuation methodology is the number of customers I have at the moment a transaction comes versus my return on invested capital and ability to continue to attract capital for reinvestment, you do different things. And I think they're in a different place than some others that are in the industry. Now, we all have to navigate around that. I mean, there's plenty of examples in the airline industry and elsewhere where there's high fixed cost structures where you have to figure out how to move through those dynamics. And I think telecom is absolutely no different. But we're getting to a moment where decisions around reinvestment in that business are going to be pretty significant. Got an auction coming up that's going to require a fair amount of investment in spectrum, and they are going to need spectrum. They can no longer just work on the fixed cost structure that they have in place if they want to continue to grow. That's going to be real money. It's ultimately money that's going to have real returns on it. And I think it's going to cause them to do some things differently over the long haul unless some kind of a structural change comes to play. I think there's some things that he's done that have been good for the industry. There's a lot of transparency that's come into the industry that we've all benefited by. I'll give you one example. They're not a no contract carrier. They put the contract on the equipment. But the good news about that is subsidy that used to be in the equipment model where everybody said, wow, I can go buy this great smartphone or this iPhone, and it's $199. It's amazing what this phone does for $199. It's the greatest thing that's ever been made. I'd buy a lot of those for $199, right? Well, the phone really didn't cost $199. But the consumer felt that it did. Now the fact that the consumer begins to understand that that phone is actually a lot more than $199, and they're carrying the direct cost of that, behaviors are different, right? Device replacement cycles are extending. People take greater care of them. They handle their kids' expectations around how they treat the property differently. That transparency that came in that separated the subsidy that was going on to put the $199 price point on the device that was being repaid in the monthly service fee, I think is good for the industry. Now you're actually looking at the monthly service fee and saying, wow, for $45 a month, that service actually is pretty darn good of what occurs. I get a lot of utility out of that. I now appropriately assess the utility of the $800 handset, right? And so I think that's a good example of, they've done some things that have been healthy for the industry.
Yeah, makes sense. John, say a bit more, again, the cynics will say the wireless industry is becoming a dumb pipe. It's providing access and people are going to feel a bit over time it's commoditized. Where are the key bets you can place there that avoid that scenario?
So there's a plaque hanging on my wall. It's a bronze plaque, and it's framed from a paper that was written at the founding of the T1. You know what the T1 is? It's a symmetrical 1.5 megabit circuit. And it's a strategy piece that came out of Bell Labs, and it says, the risk of introducing this technology is it will make the telephone network a dumb pipe. There's been a number of years that have transpired since then. I believe that there's nothing wrong with being in a transport business and a connectivity business if you can return your cost of capital. And if you can drive volume up and you can continue to invest to return to cost of capital, that's not an all bad place to be. It's not particularly sexy, but it does generate cash. And so I think the reality is our needs for additional connectivity and our needs for moving more things around continue to grow. And there's nothing wrong with finding ways to invest to do that more efficiently. If we start to think about the dynamics that are occurring today, networks that are built today are largely asymmetrical, the wireless network being a good example of it in many instances. Your behaviors are now becoming more symmetrical in nature, meaning you're starting to send as much up into the cloud as you're pulling down. You're self-producing content, you're using things like Periscope, you're creating Snapchat sessions. It dries up utilization. It allows for opportunities to move more bits and traffic. If you think about VR and AR, and if you believe that that's going to matter, incredibly bandwidth intensive sessions, but incredibly powerful changes in how people are going to work. There's nothing wrong with being in a business where volume continues to grow as long as the regulatory structures that are in place allow you to invest in return. Now that's not good enough. Finished services are important over time. The group before was talking about the importance of security. As more and more of your life moves over to the ability to move traffic around, you're going to become more concerned with things like that. Our job is to make sure you're getting some of those value-added services on top of that that prefer our ability to move that bit over somebody else's. More seamless connectivity. You're not thinking about what's happening in your home versus outside of your home. More access to content so that you understand that when you buy connectivity from a particular company, you can really get a good stuff. If you really like Go 90, get Go 90. But if you're more interested in House of Cards or you're more interested in Game of Thrones, you go over to the guy that can actually bring that to you. So I think the dynamic around this is there's nothing wrong with being in the bit hauling business as long as there's an incentive to invest in infrastructure that provides the return. And then our job over time is to make sure that we can move up the value chain.
Makes sense. Let me ask a couple other questions, and then we're going to go to questions from the audience here. We've talked a lot about domestic U.S. issues here. As you think about markets outside the U.S., what do you think about those? Where do you see opportunities? Where do you say I'm not that interested?
It's a huge issue. When I went into the corporate development job 3.5 years ago, there were two priorities that my boss and I discussed walking in, and one of them was we had to diversify revenues in the business. We just did not have enough outside the U.S., and it was for all the reasons you might think of. You want to diversify revenues. It was also just a desire that, depending on where policy went in the U.S., it was important for us to have bets placed in a variety of different governmental and regulatory constructs. We reinvest about $23 billion a year in our business annually in making capital investment decisions. And so if you're reinvesting $23 billion a year every year back in your business, and you're only captive to kind of one economic model, regulatory construct, that's probably not the ultimate in diversification. And so getting revenues balanced outside the U.S. is something we tried very hard to do. I spent a lot of time early on, scanning the globe for opportunities to do that. And in an infrastructure business, it's a little bit harder than when you're just in a services business. For some strange reason, certain governments tend to view that infrastructure as being something that's important to the well-being of their country, and they're not really excited about foreign ownership. Now that barrier is breaking down, and there are places to go make those bets. We recently bought a couple companies down in Mexico, and we're now investing at a pretty aggressive clip in Mexico. The intent of this is a North American footprint and allowing us to follow customers throughout North America. There's trade lanes for our enterprise customers. There's a lot of mobility between population groups, for example, in LA that move back and forth between the border. It makes sense from a customer perspective to be able to do that. There will be other areas around the globe that allow for that direct foreign investment. Now it's slow. It's slow to be able to make those moves globally, but we have to continue to bring greater diversification in. And you have to do it in a way that's consistent with what's happening in the U.S. The U.S. is leading in how the TMT industry is coming together, how services are coming together. And so while Latin America is behind the U.S., 5 years from now, it will look more like the U.S. And so you need to make sure you can get a path to the right asset base that allows you to be able to offer all services over time, and you're not in a situation where you're kind of left naked and having some key component of infrastructure to be successful.
Yep, makes sense. I'm going to ask a final question. Those of you that have questions, we've got a couple of microphones here, so feel free to come down here. John, let me ask you, you lead a very large workforce. Your career, you've been with the company almost 30 years, moved around a lot of great roles. I've had the same opportunity. As you think about a millennial workforce today, where you get an impression there's less kind of loyalty and sense that you're going to join a company and stay there for 30 years, how do you think about that issue yourself as you're managing a millennial workforce and beyond?
Yeah, it's a huge issue, and it's not only an issue about adjusting for the company, but it's how people think about managing their careers moving forward. My son asked me, comes in, asks for, he's 24, almost 25, asks for advice, and I go, don't ask me. The last thing you want to do is kind of pattern my career, right? You're not going to have a career like mine. You're not going to spend 30 years working for one company. You're not going to have an environment of which you can learn different disciplines and move between things within the confines of a corporate structure. And so I think you have a generation coming up that has to think about their career and their life in chapters. And I tell him, you know, every 5 years you need to be thinking about what is your next set of plays, what is the new set of skills, what's your new value proposition, and how are you getting yourself ready to make those transitions and those shifts. And you, outside of the walls of a formal education at a place like this, need to be thinking about what your continuing education construct is to ensure that every 5 years you're ready to make a jump into a new chapter and a new discipline, because he's not going to have the luxury of kind of doing it in the lower risk environment that I did during my career. As we think about it within the hiring construct is, I've got to be able to convince this generation that coming and investing 5 years with me is worth their time, that it's exciting enough, that it's interesting, with all the other things that this generation expects around it. Some autonomy, the ability to give back to their community, the ability to build social relationships with people at work, the fact that they can come in and invest 5 years and feel like there's some significant upside for them after 5 years, that, you know, they're not just going to earn a wage, but they'll get something back for their achievement over that period of time, and then have the flexibility to go do something else. And as an employer, I got to be comfortable with that, and I got to set up an environment that allows them to do that. And that's very different for a business like ours, and we're having to change incentive structures. We're having to think differently about how we set up internal metrics around how we measure the success of organizations, how we deal with long-term compensation constructs. It's a very, very different construct for this generation, and one that you know, we're working really hard to change. And I'll tell you, our effectiveness level is we're probably doing it at about 50% of the effectiveness levels I'd like to see us be able to do over time, but we're getting better.
Excellent. Good. Let's take questions from the audience here. We've got one there.
We've seen a changing regulatory environment in recent years, particularly at the FCC, and the talk about government regulation of the internet. A couple questions in that area. A, how does that affect your business? B, do you think overall the regulatory stuff, this idea of the internet providers as managed as utilities, is constructive? And what would you recommend to improve? What would be constructive regulation in your space?
Wow. It's not just the last few years, it's the last few months. So think about what's happened in the construct of investment, of regulation of investment in a key part of our infrastructure. If you believe that, you know, highways and roads were important for generations past, investment in infrastructure that moves bits around has got to be one of the more important things for our industry and our country, right, to be competitive. And just let's go back a year. Title II gets passed, which effectively puts in place federal regulation of rates, structure, and investment for all consumer broadband services, mobile or fixed. Proceedings launched at the FCC to govern how privacy is used within a select group of companies that invest in infrastructure, to ensure that they're not in a position to monetize and run two-sided business models, subscription and advertising or subscription and data-centric, and put confines on that. Set-top box rules to dictate, because people don't have enough choices in video service today, the government is going to put in confines around how set-top boxes are sold, engineered, and put out. Last Thursday, or earlier this week, an announcement of a proceeding to re-regulate business broadband services, all high-capacity business services that serve the likes of Bank of America and Wells Fargo, because apparently that's not competitive enough. This is all just in the last year, that is all sitting in front of the FCC right now. You know, frankly, if I think about the problems that are facing this country and the things that we want government to step up to, I wouldn't have guessed that getting higher bandwidth services to businesses was the most pressing problem this country was facing at the moment. And I think if you're walking into most CIOs' offices that I walk into and you ask them, what's the biggest problem managing your cost structure? It's not what I'm paying for the 10 gig circuit coming into my data center or into my branch office that I'm worried about. And so I would tell you that we've totally allowed the pendulum to swing back the other way. Depending on where these proceedings come out, they will either get rolled back or overturned in court, or it's going to stifle investment in infrastructure. If it stifles investment in infrastructure, then you're going to open the door for other regions around the globe to invest at a heavier pace. If I'm not incented to take that $23 billion and roll it every year and we decide can't make money here, I'd rather go invest heavier in Mexico, I'd rather go invest heavier in Brazil or wherever I choose to do it, because my returns are better. Capital is fungible, it will move. It will move to where there's an opportunity to go and earn its return. And I would tell you right now, policy-wise, if the FCC gets to where they want to go, we will see a stifling of investment and it will move elsewhere. There's a lot going on. It's a big stakes game. We're fighting some of it tooth and nail in the courts. The appeals court on the Title II issue is about ready to come out. We believe, we're pretty comfortable with when we listen to the proceeding, that we will prevail, and ultimately what they did will be found to be illegal. And so hopefully cooler minds will prevail.
Good, so let's take a couple last questions here. Josh?
Hey, so you talked about investment in the business of moving bits and also trying to work your way back up that chain, which I would assume, at least on the video side, to include investments in some of your video production partners and possibly even directly branded video content. Could you talk about how video content is going to impact the business of moving bits?
Yeah, I think the fundamental issue is, you all hear the discussion around most products coming out the market today. Most of the innovation is coming in full stack solutions. Said another way, people want to move basically horizontally through the value chain, right? And so I do believe distribution and content production ultimately get married closer together over time. As you start to break apart some of these distribution arrangements that are there, they're not going to happen overnight, but they are going to erode and change. That you're going to see this natural dynamic of distribution and content production coming closer and closer together. And I think it's fair to say that our value proposition and our desire will probably be to shift our position in the value chain over time. Now, how you shift that and over what time frame and how you allocate the capital to move in that direction, that's kind of a pace and amount level. Probably not something I'm going to lay out on the table exactly in a perfectly transparent way in a setting like this, but I would tell you, yes, you'll see us leaning in over time to do a lot more to marry content and distribution closer together, both in terms of the business relationships we have and our direct ability to manage and control that.
Mm-hmm.
Hi, can you comment on AT&T's point of view on subscription bundles, and more specifically, as consumers have more and more options with entertainment add-on subscriptions, where's the upper limit, and how do you approach consumers in that regards from a marketing standpoint?
So let's talk about the video bundle. Is that specifically where
Yes.
So on the video bundle, the upper limit is where it's at right now. You cannot continue to raise the price of the bundle at its current form of utility without severely damaging the model and the industry. So I think there's a basic limitation to the discretionary income that many customers have and what they're willing to put toward monthly entertainment, and we're about at that level right now. Now, some things can happen to improve utility of the bundle. So I believe over time, for example, what you can do to add more portability, where you're buying the content and you can take it outside the home. Your daughter or son who goes off to school can use it in their dorm room. The ability for you to stack content so that you can get it multiple seasons of the shows that you love to watch on your time frame. All these are things that can come in to add more value into it to make it worthwhile to continue to subscribe. But I also believe that consumers are going to make decisions to start thinning down how much they buy in a bundle so that they have choices to make discretionary, point-specific acquisition of content. Netflix would be an example, but other emerging forms of digital media. What we're doing with the Chernin Group is to play in both worlds, right? We're intending to develop more digital-oriented advertising that's more media that's more fragmented. So I think you're at that limit, and the model's changing. It's just a question if you got to play both sides of the fence. You want to play both subscription and advertising, and you kind of have to go skate to where the puck is going.
Good. So John, listen, in closing, let me just say a huge thank you. Your success is not a surprise. Your thoughtfulness, the results you've achieved, what you're managing, huge, and you're a great role model and success story from Anderson. So thank you so much.
Terry. Appreciate
it.
the time. Thank you.